Polling shows a majority of Americans support the Supreme Court's latest Second Amendment ruling, plus a conversation with Timothy Lytton on how guns will impact the Senate runoff. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today. It comes out every Friday. And you'll get updates on the latest in gun news across the country, stuff you won't find anywhere else. It's often exclusive reporting that we do, that we focus on at The Reload. And if you want to dive deeper than just that free newsletter, you can also purchase a membership where you'll get exclusive access to hundreds of stories that you literally can't find anywhere else because they are member exclusive pieces. And you'll also get this podcast a day early, as well as the opportunity to appear on the show in a member segment, which we should have some of those coming up again real soon for you guys. I always enjoy doing those. But this week, we are talking about the Georgia runoffs. We're looking ahead to those. We're that race. There's only one this time around, but it's going to be a big one that determines the ultimate control of the Senate, whether it's 50-50 or 51-49 in favor of Democrats. And so we have somebody from Georgia, an expert, a professor at Georgia State University. Tim Lytton is on with us to discuss the events in that state. How are you doing, Tim? How are things down there? Is it the Peach State? Is that right? Or is that just the fruit, the official fruit?
The Peach State, that's right. We're doing fine.
Okay. And can you tell people just a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Yeah, I'm a professor of law at Georgia State University College of Law, and I write primarily about civil liability and public policy and public health. And among the things I've written about is for the last 25 years, I've been writing about lawsuits against the firearms industry, both sellers and manufacturers, federal immunity, Second Amendment rights, and the issues surrounding that. And I also generally just follow gun control and gun politics.
Yep, and I'm sure you're seeing all the campaign ads for the last. I mean, you guys get it just constantly because of this runoff system, and that none of these candidates can ever seem to get 50% in the initial election. So you guys get the extended election season there, right?
Yeah, basically we just turn off the phone 6 months before every election and kind of don't hook up the landline until we're done.
But every UGA game and every Atlanta Falcons game, you gotta. All the ads are commercials for campaigns, I'd imagine, right?
That's right.
Yes. But so we've got now some of your elections were finished, and we'll talk a little bit about, for instance, the gubernatorial election there between Kemp and Stacey Abrams and how that all went out. But first off, we want to focus on the Senate election. Incumbent Democrat Raphael Warnock was not quite able to get to 50% during the general election, and so he now heads to a runoff with challenger Hershel Walker, who's a Republican backed by Donald Trump, but Warnock was ahead by a couple points, right, in the general election, and polling seems to indicate that he still has a lead at this point. Is that the baseline of what we're seeing?
Yeah, I don't know if he was ahead a couple points. I mean, he was ahead by a very slim margin. They both came in just under 50%. So we're talking about, at least in the general election, a kind of razor thin margin. The runoff election, he seems to be pulling a couple points ahead based on early polling about voter turnout, but we still have some time to go. And the general election was extremely close.
Yeah, correct. And there was a libertarian candidate that took like 2% of the vote, something around there. And that's why Warnock was not quite able to reach that 50% plus one vote margin that you need in
either
Georgia.
Warnock or Walker in that case, right? We don't know which way the libertarian voters would have gone or if they would have turned out without that alternative.
Right. That's a very good point. Perhaps some of those voters are more Walker leaning than Warnock leaning. I guess that's exactly what we're going to find out here in this runoff. But that's why we're in this situation, and that's sort of the state of play right now. Warnock seems to be he was ahead in the vote tally for the general. He seems to be polling ahead a little bit in the runoff right now. But we want to focus obviously on gun politics here. How much have you seen the issue play a role in the Warnock Walker election in particular thus far?
Firearms rights and gun control always plays a role in Georgia politics. It's at the top of the statewide political agenda, year in and year out. That and religious liberty are really at the very top of the agenda. And you see pretty much in every legislative session movement on those things. There's gridlock on a lot of issues, but when it comes to firearms rights and gun control, there's always movement. And in Georgia, in particular, in the direction of gun rights, we've had a steady stream of victories for gun rights advocates at the state level. So it always plays a role. I think that what we're looking at in the Warnock Walker runoff is that, a lot of people are already kind of locked into their positions. So during the general election, it's important to create that turnout, let people know where you stand on the issues. Warnock has situated himself very clearly as pro-gun control, and Walker as very clearly pro-advancing for gun rights. And the question now is how to kind of eke out a margin. And it's unclear to me whether or not firearms laws, both gun rights and gun control, are likely to actually be a big player in determining that margin. I think they've been very important in sort of building the base for both of these campaigns. But it looks like from recent polling, actually, that there are a lot of other issues on the statewide agenda that people care about more, and that what we're talking about is those swing voters in the middle. And it's not clear that they are going to be motivated by gun issues. Ironically, one reason for that might be that the gun rights movement has been so strong here in Georgia, with the governor signing permitless carry. In some ways, that, along with the Bruin decision that came down from the Supreme Court, the Second Amendment decision that struck down New York's carry laws, the permit carry laws, it's possible that those victories have taken a little bit of the wind out of the sails of advocates for firearms rights. And in the sense that, if what it takes to get people to turn out to vote is to be kind of riled up about something, they may be a little less riled up and feeling a little bit more confident about the position of gun rights in America right now, and in particular in Georgia. And that might be a slightly less of a motivator to get people out. On the other side, we have this steady string of, sort of routine mass shootings coverage in the media, in the national media, and also here in Georgia. And that may act as a motivator at the margins. So it's a little hard to tell so far, but it's possible that gun rights might come out weighing a little stronger, or gun control might come out weighing a little stronger for Warnock. But keep in mind, there are other things on the statewide agenda that may be calling people's attention more, especially because gun rights advocates have had so many victories here recently.
Yeah, those are all very good points, I think, as far as how this issue impacts the turnout in the both in the general election and now in this runoff. Because I do think, and we'll get to the governor's race a little bit later, but that really had guns more at the center of the campaign, because you had Kemp push through his promised permitless carry bill, which went into effect in Georgia. And then obviously you had Stacey Abrams criticizing that move. And there was even, they canceled a music festival in Atlanta over this change. And so that was part of the campaign. And we'll talk about that stuff later. But it seems to me in the senatorial race, it hasn't been as central of an issue. Certainly there's a clear contrast, like you talked about, because and Warnock seems to be more aggressively pursuing gun control, almost counterintuitively, than his counterpart, Ossoff, who's the other Democrat that was elected in 2020, but isn't up for re-election this year, because Warnock is signed on as a co-sponsor for the Senate's version of the assault weapons ban, the ban on AR-15s and AK-47s and other firearms, whereas Ossoff hasn't done that. And then on the other side, you have Walker, who's sort of he's like running as generic Republican guy with the football background, and he's like celebrity guy, but his policy positions are pretty, not very well developed. Like his campaign website doesn't talk much about guns, and so or any specific policies that he wants to implement. But so I'm wondering about the state of, for instance, the advertising there that you're seeing from these campaigns. Are either one of them focusing on the gun issue?
For sure, Warnock is focusing on the gun issue. Warnock's got kind of a collection of standard Democratic issues. He's talking about abortion rights and reproductive rights. He's talking about health care. He's talking about the economy, and he's talking about gun control. I think on the Walker side is where you're seeing something that's a little bit outside the normal playbook. So it's not unusual that Warnock would be featuring gun control in his campaign ads and his television ads, because that's really kind of bread and butter for a lot of national Democrats in terms of their platform. But Walker, in some sense, has fronted two issues. I don't know whether this has been his own by design or whether or not he just sort of fallen into them. One is, of course, his loyalty to Donald Trump. And I think that that's probably a liability for him at this point, because I think that there are a lot of people in the Republican base who are strong supporters of Donald Trump. And there are lots of people on the Democratic side who are strong opponents. And then the question is, well, where are the swing voters? And the fact of the matter is, in Georgia, a lot of the swing voters are Republican voters who are pro the Republican agenda, but not so happy with Donald Trump. And that probably explains why it is that Kemp had such an easy time getting over the line compared to Walker. And he was polling way ahead of Walker. And that's, I think, in part due to the fact that he was carrying with him some swing voters on the Republican side. The other thing that sort of Walker either came out, I think he sort of put himself out front on this, and then it kind of got ahead of him, which is on the issue of abortion rights. He came out kind of very strong and in some ways extreme opinions, even for Georgia, on restrictions on abortion access. And then, of course, the national press has raised questions about his own personal history with regard to those things. And I think those are things that probably didn't serve him so well. And so in that sense, gun rights has not played a prominent role in his campaign in a way that it would normally if you had sort of a mainstream Republican running against a mainstream Democrat.
Yeah. I feel like that's what I've seen from outside the state as well. Is Warnock seems to be leaning a little more into gun control than you might expect from a Democrat in Georgia, but certainly not outside of what you get from national Democrats, in general. And then Walker is running much less of an issue-focused campaign outside of, and really more of a personality-driven campaign, right? Yeah, which makes sense to a certain degree, right? He's a celebrity candidate, and so that's what comes with that. But yeah, it seems to be at the cost of de-emphasizing, issues that might appeal to some of those Republican swing voters, like gun rights.
I think that's true, and I think Warnock's trying to peel off a handful of Republican swing voters based on the sort of anybody but Trump attitude. But the other thing to keep in mind is that one thing that Warnock's doing, and Ossoff certainly did this in his race, they're playing a turnout game. So they're not just playing for swing voters, they're playing to actually build out their base and get a larger turnout. And, there are a lot of different ways to go around swinging a state like Georgia. And one is to try to pick off the middle. And if that's the case, then as a Democrat, you'd want to be very careful about coming out too strong on gun control. But the other is to try and turn out your base and sort of expand to the left. And if that's the case, then I think in urban centers like Atlanta or sort of more liberal areas like Athens, and there aren't a huge number of other places where the base is strong, but those two places in particular, especially in Atlanta where gun violence is a big issue, you have a large urban voting base that are Democratic, many of whom, even if they're firearms owners, are not averse to gun control and just have a different relationship to the issue. And so Warnock may be coming out swinging a lot harder on the issue in part for that reason.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I do remember Ossoff's campaign in 2020. They actually moderated their position on guns depending on where they were running ads. I haven't seen any news to that effect in this race for Warnock, but it certainly makes a lot of sense that, especially in a runoff where you really are more trying to turn out your base than convince swing voters who might show up, in a general election. They might not be there in a runoff election. Sorry. And so, that certainly makes sense.
I think that's very true. You see this on the Republican side as well. If you go up into upstate Georgia or you go into rural districts in the South, you see a lot of lawn signs with AR-15 platform weapons kind of on the lawn sign with the political candidate's name. That's not the kind of Republican advertising you see in Atlanta. In Atlanta, Republicans, whether they're statewide or local, are running on a business platform, strong economy. Gun rights are certainly part of that, but you don't have like rallies where people are talking about the symbolism of, carrying an AR-15 platform weapon in public as a sort of essential feature of liberty. And so there's a huge variation in both parties in terms of what the appeal and what the message is around guns, like everything else, and what's emphasized and what's not.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I'm wondering about beyond the campaigns themselves is, we have a new piece that on the Reload talking about the outside groups and their spending. And what's really fascinating to me is that, so the NRA has gotten into this race. They've spent a couple $1 million at this point on advertising to boost Walker and to attack Warnock, which, it makes sense. But they're involved, they're spending money. But at the same time, you're not seeing the gun control groups do any of that. Apparently, they're just not getting involved in this race at all, at least yet, not to this point. Do you have any insight as to why that might be?
Yeah, I don't know whether it's true that the gun control groups have not gotten involved. I just think that there may be a different strategy going on here. I think a lot of people are asking this question, so we don't know for sure. But it may be that the NRA and gun rights groups nationally are looking to basically reach people through advertising, especially, for instance, in sort of far-flung rural districts. And so media and television are important, and that involves a lot of heavy-duty spending really to get any impact at all. If you're going to hit the airwaves, you have to hit them pretty hard. On the other side, it may be that gun control groups are looking more to mobilize urban voters, and they may be, and I've seen this in the press, spending a lot more time just trying to organize volunteers to go out and kind of turn out the vote. I'll just give you an example. We live in a heavily Democratic district in Atlanta, and we've been getting, 2 or 3 letters a day from people all over the country, people we'd never heard of, who are basically writing us personal letters, postcards on the back that says, please turn out to vote in the Georgia elections. And so I think a lot of that effort is being mobilized by progressive groups, including gun control groups, but that's not the kind of spending that you need in order to get advertising. That's kind of community organizing, but I think there's a lot of effort going in there.
Okay, that's interesting. So you're saying that obviously the way we know whether the groups are spending in races is based off their FEC filings, and you only have to file those reports for certain kinds of activities like buying ads or donating directly to candidates or donating staff time to candidates' campaigns, but you don't necessarily have to disclose those expenditures if they're just for things like a generic effort to get out the vote. That's not, a partisan effort, not an attempt to organize with a particular campaign. But if you're just trying to get your voters out to vote, that's not necessarily going to show up on an FEC filing. So that's interesting. So you think they're, instead of focusing on ads and mailers or things like that, they're focused on get out the vote operations that are ostensibly nonpartisan.
Yeah, I don't even know if they're nonpartisan. I just think a lot of them don't require spending cash. So, I think I'm getting a postcard a day from some volunteer in Portland, Oregon, or Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota, who's sort of joined up to help the Democratic Party. And they're shooting off, X number of postcards to predetermined addresses in democratically leaning voting districts in Atlanta. And that may not even be a campaign expenditure, although it's a campaign effort. I suspect that gun control groups are mobilizing in this way and that they're playing a role in the campaign. They may just not be cutting checks in order to do it.
Yeah. And like I said, there are ways you can mobilize voters without having to report to the FEC what you're doing exactly or what you're spending. And so perhaps they're doing that, but it does still seem, whether or not they're doing get out the vote efforts, as you described, like it seems odd to just cede the rest of the ground there to the NRA, doesn't it?
It may be that actually that the gun control groups think that they'd probably be better off not coming out swinging too hard in Georgia on gun control. And then they'd probably rather let sort of Walker get out ahead of himself on abortion rights or on his association with Donald Trump. And then in fact, the best way to advance their cause is to, basically let those other issues play out. Because as I said, I think everybody knows we're playing for swing voters here at the margin or at the base. There may be activities going on in terms of mobilizing the base, but I don't know. And again, all of this is speculation because we don't really have a lot of insight as to sort of what the gun control groups are thinking about in terms of their strategy in this particular race.
Mm-hmm. Sure, but we do have what they're spending money on, and it's
for sure,
or at least what they're not spending money on.
It's a good question,
which is interesting. I wonder if they just maybe feel like. I mean, it's certainly, like you said, they have at times tried to focus on issues that were more pertinent to a campaign than guns, even though they're using funds from their, from Everytown or Giffords. They might run ads that are more about abortion rights than they are about gun restrictions. They certainly did that throughout the midterm elections, and they've done that in the 2020 elections as well, with focusing on healthcare was one of the big ones in 2020. They put money into ads that talked about healthcare instead of gun policy, or at least tried to connect the two in some way. They did that a lot with abortion this time around, and so it's interesting to see that they're even if they do believe there's a better strategy to put forth than going hard on gun control in Georgia, they could spend money on those sort of abortion ads or attack ads against Walker for his positions or what have you. and they're just not doing it to this point. Maybe they're saving up time. I mean, there's not a lot of time, right, in these ads. These elections, they happen fairly quickly compared to, a normal general election. And so, it does make you wonder, like maybe they just feel like these races are in hand. Like maybe they just don't think Walker can pull off a comeback. I don't know. Do you think maybe they're getting too overconfident, or is there something else?
I mean, that seems pretty speculative to me. I'm not sure I would suggest that the gun control advocacy groups think they've sort of way out ahead. If anything, they're playing defense most of the time. And in a state like Georgia, they really haven't made any headway at all. So as I said, I think their primary strategy is to try and figure out how best to support the Warnock campaign. And that may not involve sort of heavy duty exposure on the airwaves, especially in rural districts where, he's trying to lower margins that are going to generally go for Walker. So I couldn't speak exactly to that, but it's also possible that the NRA just has more available disposable cash right now to put into this race, and that every town's been running in more places, or they just have less disposable income right now to deal with the issue. So that's also hard to know.
That is a good point. We did see towards the end of the campaign season when they put in their last filings. We'll get more information when they're in their post-election filings that come out, I believe, on December 8th. And we'll of course be covering that and likely do a whole podcast on everyone's spending. But we did see at the end of the midterms that the NRA had a much larger stockpile of cash on hand to work with. They don't seem to have spent most of that money in the closing days of the campaign, whereas, every town in Giffords didn't have money on their books. Of course, you can transfer, money's fungible, so you can transfer it around between their different groups, which all of these gun groups are very competent at. They're all professionals. They know what they're doing with this kind of stuff. But that's a fair point. It could be that they spent a lot of their money in the general election. They just didn't save up enough for big spends in this runoff. But that is something that we just don't know at this point. They haven't, of course, come out and said why. They haven't responded to our request for comment on this issue as of right now. So, this is a lot of just kind of look at this landscape and figure it out ourselves. But I want to move on real quick here to the gubernatorial election and just looking back on that. So we went over here what's to look forward to. You got a lot of spending from the NRA, not much from the gun control groups, but Warnock does seem to be ahead right now. We'll see how that plays out. We'll just have to keep watching that race for the moment. But one race we can look back on with more of a definitive tone is the gubernatorial election. You had Governor Kemp beat Stacey Abrams, the Democratic challenger, for a second time in a row. Guns did, as we mentioned earlier, seem to play more of a direct role in that race. What is your takeaway from that outcome?
I think that Governor Kemp certainly positioned himself way out ahead nationally on gun rights. I think that's usually a winning issue statewide in Georgia. I think it's extremely important to the base. And I think there's a growing number of people, especially, newer firearms owners, for whom this is an important issue. At the same time, there's something strange about the polling. I read a Atlanta Journal-Constitution poll that suggested that actually there was not even close to majority support among respondents to a poll for the permitless carry, and that in fact, support for it had been going up, but that it had peaked, at least so far, it's reached about 35%, and that 65% of voters suggested that they opposed permitless carry. I don't think that reflects people's general orientation to firearms rights. I think many people support firearms rights. As to whether or not they supported permitless carry per se, I think that's less clear. And so one of the takeaways from this, I think, might be that while Brian Kemp is sort of looking for ways to push the envelope on gun rights and to sort of expand them, he may have run out of things that have sort of broad appeal. And so, he's pushing something like permitless carry, where there are a lot of people who may be in favor of carry laws, but are nervous about permitless carry in the current context, who, when they think about all things considered, generally want to vote for somebody who's not going to impose new gun controls or gun restrictions. Stacey Abrams' agenda on this may not appeal to them, but it's not clear to me that they're actually big backers in large numbers of permitless carry. And so people may be voting sort of more generally on the idea of favoring gun rights and the right to carry, but not necessarily wanting to loosen up the ability to carry in terms of permitless carry. I don't know how that's going to play out. I mean, I think that this issue's settled in the state. We have this new law. It's not likely to be reversed. And Brian Kemp's been elected, so he's going to have time to work on, gun rights and other issues. But as to whether or not he wants to push the envelope a lot farther is not clear to me. I think also, we mentioned this before, he benefited a lot from being independent of Donald Trump. I think that this is a state that's purple, as you know, and that I think a lot of people feel good about what they would consider to sort of be a local Republican with local Republican focus, and not somebody who's plugged into the larger debates about what's going on in the Republican Party nationally. And I think that while there's a lot of support for Donald Trump in Georgia, we're talking about the margin here again, right? We're not talking about huge margins by which the governor won, and we're talking about a runoff in the Senate. People are looking for, what about those middle of the roaders? And a lot of those are Republicans who I think feel very comfortable with Brian Kemp, both because he's an incumbent. He generally stands for things they care about, including gun rights, and they're not that interested in drilling down in a lot of the details. And one thing they know about him that they like is he's independent of whatever might make them nervous in the National Republican Party.
Yeah, I think that's really good analysis. There's probably a lot of gray area here. It's not like, oh, well, it's obvious that because Kemp supported and passed permitless carry and just Abrams opposed it, that's why the race went this way. I don't think that's too simplistic. Of course, there's a lot more interesting, tidbits to talk about there. And permitless carry doesn't poll very well, really nationwide or in most states, even where it's been implemented. But it is sort of, it does seem like some of these red states, they're getting to a point where, what do you do now? Like, you have a lot of the policies in place that gun rights advocates want, especially the ones that poll poll much better. And so,
plus you have Bruin.
Where do you go from there?
Right. You have the Supreme Court basically locking them in. Mm-hmm. It's going to be much harder to roll these back, not as a matter of politics, but as a matter of law. The Supreme Court's emerging Second Amendment jurisprudence really protects a lot of these advances. And I think that also creates a amount of security. The other thing is, there's a flip side of this story about Kemp being tied to Trump, which is, I think that, Kemp was independent. I think that worked in his favor. I think Stacey Abrams is seen as very tied to the Biden administration and to the National Democratic Party and the sort of, in particular, the progressive wing. And I'm not sure that served her as well in Georgia as independents might have. And so I think that in that sense, it was sort of a double boost. It seems to me that the candidates that have strong ties to sort of non-Georgia players, whether they're Democratic or Republican, probably are at a disadvantage at the margin to candidates who are seen as sort of more independent and focused just on Georgia.
Yeah. And I think the permitless carry thing is interesting too, because it doesn't poll well right now, but all of the governors who signed one into law won re-election this year. So it's not something that necessarily changes people's votes in the opposite direction, perhaps, or at least not at the very top of their list of things that would. And of course, the approval rating of permitless carry could increase over time if it doesn't lead to the sort of things that opponents, claim it will. Blood in the streets sort of rhetoric you get.
I don't think anybody's voting against someone who voted for permitless carry, because the alternative isn't a candidate who says they want to keep the status quo, just roll back permitless carry. It's usually a candidate who wants to impose new gun restrictions, licensing, or stronger background checks, or other things that people don't, aren't in favor of. So I just don't think that permitless carry is not going to be a problem in that sense until there's a perceived sort of moderate position that basically is pro-gun rights, pro-carrying, but with greater restrictions. There's too much polarization on the issue. And so I think people who are generally in favor of gun rights are not going to look askance at a gun rights measure that may go beyond what they feel comfortable with, as long as the alternative is something that they definitely don't feel comfortable with, which is greater controls on the right to carry.
Yeah, I think that really hits the nail on the head there as to the dynamic in that Georgia gubernatorial election. Stacey Abrams, it did seem like at points tried to present a more moderate position on guns than even perhaps Warnock, for instance, where, I know she, in comments to us, we interviewed Kemp early on in the race, and Stacey Abrams' campaign responded to our questions. And I felt like her position was more, she doesn't like permitless carry, but the campaign tried to paint it as she's more of a moderate on this issue. Like, she wants some more restrictions. She doesn't like what Kemp is pushing to remove. But then, of course, I think her comments herself, she made a couple comments about wanting to, outlaw more firearms, the possession of more firearms, and so I think it was hard for her to campaign to strike that balance, and ultimately, most of their rhetoric was more on the restrictive side and less on the we're just looking to keep things the way they are or do minor changes, if that makes sense. And it's probably and you're right. I think the national perception of her as this sort of progressive hero probably added to that too.
Yeah, and I think also, we don't have anybody who campaigns on the following position. I think things are basically where they ought to be, and I don't want to move them any farther. I mean, that just doesn't make for good campaign copy. And so I don't think Stacey Abrams had a convincing case that basically she believed in things like campus carry and, permitted carry, by right. And she was worried about, she just didn't want to go to permitless carry. I mean, that's just not a position that I think it's too nuanced, for one thing, sort of for the airwaves. And second, it's just not the kind of position that people take up. People run, if they're not incumbents, against the status quo. They don't say, basically, I just want to lock in where we are now. That's especially true when your base is virulently opposed to where we are now. So I think that it's just a hard position, and I'm not sure it's a great issue for her to run on in Georgia, other than to try and turn out her base. But as far as appealing to the middle, I just don't think it's easy to make a convincing case that it's just permitless carry that she was worried about, and then to cleave off those voters. I don't think politics works that way. People have general ideas when they walk into the voting booth. This candidate is essentially going to protect my right to carry a firearm and own a firearm under whatever conditions that might be. And that candidate wants to ban more gun designs and wants to make it harder for me to purchase one the next time I go to the store. And that's how people break it down. I think when you're in a legislative session, things are a little bit more nuanced. But in a general statewide campaign like this, I just don't think people are breaking things down that much. And candidates that try and create those fine distinctions have a hard time messaging.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, real quick here, just to wrap us up, why don't we look forward a little bit? What do you see now with the results of the most recent election inside of Georgia, as far as the state legislature goes? Where do you see gun policy moving in the state? Do you see it moving at all? I mean, you talked about earlier, there's not a lot of places left to go, right? I'm sure that gun rights advocates in the state will have ideas, right? But what do you foresee happening there?
It's hard to tell. A lot of it just depends on the climate around firearms politics. I think if things are relatively quiet, I think a lot of people are basically satisfied. I don't know we're going to see this move a lot. But my experience, I've been in Georgia for 7 years, and every single year there's something new. One year it's campus carry, the next year it's permitless carry. I think there's been a lot of fighting about restrictions on permitless carry where you're not allowed to bring your firearm in, and there may be some agitation around those things. Again, I think we've probably gone past where the sort of mainstream gun rights supporters are, which is they wanted permitted carry. They wanted, not a lot of restrictions, and they don't want a lot of money poured into the background check system. And they're not in favor of red flag laws. But, gun rights advocates seem to be wanting to push more. And I think one of the places left to push is there are restrictions on where you can carry your firearm, things that are sort of quasi-public or private venues. And what's the difference between those? And we may see sort of a greater push for example, greater clarity, your ability to take your weapon to a public event, for example, to a ball game or other places like that. I'm not sure those are such popular issues among your bedrock gun rights, voters. I think a lot of those people basically feel that they have a right to purchase a weapon now in Georgia. They have a right to carry it without a permit, unless they have some strike against them. And that basically that's what they want to do with their firearm. They want to carry it around for self-protection.
On the furthest end of the spectrum, we've seen a couple states pass Second Amendment sanctuary laws. We had the Second Amendment sanctuary movement that was more of a county-based movement, and their resolutions were sort of almost more symbolic in nature than they were legal. But since then, you've had a couple states, including Missouri, for instance, where they've passed the Second Amendment sanctuary laws that also all kind of feel symbolic in a certain sense, that they're meant to address like the potential of gun confiscation from the federal government down the line. But in practice, what they do is make it so that local law enforcement can't cooperate with federal law enforcement to enforce gun crimes unless there is an accompanying state crime for that, which in practice, most state laws do mirror federal law on, the big questions like felon in possession laws or involuntary commitments. But you have seen some of this create at least confusion, I would say, or at least, and perhaps even give maybe convenient excuses for some localities, like in St. Louis, where they had a school shooting after the shooter had failed a background check, but the St. Louis chief of police there said that they couldn't prosecute. He claimed that they couldn't prosecute the attacker after that failed background check because of this state level sanctuary law. The governor obviously disagrees. I've seen legal experts from the state that disagree with the St. Louis police as well, but obviously it's created this situation. And so it's leading to perhaps unintended consequences like this. Do you think that, but it is something that's very highly symbolic, of course. People like the idea of, the state taking up to defend their gun rights, even in a symbolic manner, that they like that, pushing back against the federal government. I'm sure there's a lot of people who support that sort of approach. Is that something we could see in Georgia, or is it?
No, I'm sure there are people who are going
atmosphere?
to advocate this in Georgia. We have advocacy for whatever's going on in the national gun rights movement. There are people here in Georgia on the front lines of it. This is a very strong gun rights state. On the other hand, I think these kinds of laws play extremely poorly. I don't think they serve the gun rights movement very well. I think people, when things go sideways in these situations, when you have something like Colorado Springs, where there was a red flag law that nobody really wanted to follow, or you have a background check that wasn't followed up because the local records aren't kept that much. You're talking often about places where tragedies occurred around firearms, and that doesn't play very well. I think most of the support for firearms carry here is premised on the idea that there are certain categories of people who won't have access to firearms. And if what we do is we expand the right to carry and we keep a strong infrastructure in place so that people who are, pose a high risk, people with mental illness, criminal records, the kind of people nobody wants toting guns around, we're probably going to continue to see continued support for gun rights. If we can, if we expand the right to carry and then we have a general lack of enforcement around the kinds of controls to make sure that the people who are at high risk for carrying out criminal misuse of the weapons, we don't have that kind of infrastructure, or local officials decide that they just don't want to be involved in enforcing those laws, I think that's going to erode support. And I actually think that's probably a tactical mistake. My sense is that mainstream players in firearms rights probably know this. And I think that a lot of what the appeal holds is it's really part of a larger package of the rule of law. I think the left has tried to paint gun rights as a kind of lawless, Waco self-help movement. And in fact, I think your average Georgia voter who is in favor of gun rights is a person who also believes very deeply in the rule of law. That's probably one reason why it is that they favor Kemp marginally over, Trump-backed candidates, is that for gun rights advocates in the mainstream, this is all a package. It's all a package about your individual right to own a firearm and the rule of law and respect for law and a system that will make sure that firearms are not getting into the wrong hands. So I think these sort of movements, it's a little on the left, like immigration sanctuaries, the idea of people sort of thumbing their nose at the rule of law and saying, well, we'd like an exception because we don't really want to go along with the pack. That just doesn't play well for immigration rights. And people who are generally sympathetic start to sort of peel off at that point. So I think that probably would be a tactical mistake here in a place like Georgia.
That's interesting. And so if that is, in fact, the majority of these sort of Georgia gun voters that exist, do you think the legislature recognizes that and wouldn't push towards, this sort of Second Amendment sanctuary, or even something like this sort of attempted nullification laws regarding silencers and suppressors that you've seen in places like Texas and Kansas?
I think you might see local initiatives. There's clearly a variation across Georgia about people's attitudes towards the federal government and, in some sense, the rule of law when it doesn't go their way. But I think the Georgia legislature generally tries to cleave off the extremes, both on the left and the right, and to trot a kind of more moderate path. We had a long-term Speaker of the House here who recently passed away, 20 years heading the legislature, and he was famous for getting things through, things like religious liberty and firearms laws, gun rights laws, And that was largely because he was able to trim off at the edges to make sure that people felt generally comfortable in the mainstream with these. And I think that the people running the Republican Party in Georgia, who are right now controlling the state house and the governor's office, I think these are people who understand that they don't want to go fringe. They want to basically maintain the positions that they've staked out. And I think permitless carry may be something that doesn't have a majority of supporters, but it doesn't seem to me like a crazy fringe idea. I think the idea of basically saying that you're not going to enforce the background check regime is probably something you're going to start to see people peeling off about.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, they did sort of take their time on permitless carry in Georgia. They were the 25th state to adopt it, and it was 4 years after Kemp had promised to get it done. He did get it done, of course, but they didn't rush through that process. So it makes a lot of sense. Well, we really appreciate you coming on.
They carried people with them, right? I mean, support for permitless carry went up over time, so they were very smart about bringing people along.
Yeah. So that what you're saying there, that analysis does make a lot of sense to me, as far as like they're not necessarily going to rush out and just try and pass something as a symbolic gesture, unless they really know it's not going to anger people, anger their constituents. So, I mean, ideally that's probably how every legislature would operate, right? But yeah, I think that makes sense, especially, with Georgia's sort of become more of a purple state these days. So they don't have as much wiggle room to the right anymore. But we really appreciate you coming on and giving us this insight from somebody who knows the topic and knows the state. Can you tell people a little bit about where they could find your writing or follow you?
Sure. You can find a lot of my writings on my faculty website at Georgia State University College of Law. So just look up Timothy Lytton, Lytton, at Georgia State University College of Law. You'll find my webpage there, and there's links to all my work.
All right. Thank you, Professor Lytton, for joining us. We're going to head over to the news update now.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined, of course, by Reload founder Steve Gutowski. How are you this morning, Steve?
Oh, I'm a little under the weather, but good enough to do the podcast. I always try to make it through. This is such a struggle.
It's that time of year. Everyone seems to be getting sick right now. I know plenty of people I know are under the weather, so it's just one of those things.
Yeah. Certainly could be much worse things you'd have to do than a podcast when you're not feeling great.
Fair enough.
I'm pretty lucky. But yeah, otherwise, it's been a pretty busy week.
Yeah.
For guns. So.
It definitely was a busy week. And among the stories making it a busy week, you have a story about a poll that just came out covering the landmark Supreme Court decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, which of course found where the Supreme Court, of course, found a right to carry a handgun or a gun outside of the house for self-defense. And we have some updated polling on what the general public thinks of that ruling, which you covered, if you want to let us know what that poll found.
Yeah, so Marquette University, which is one of the most prominent pollsters out there, one of the top national pollsters. There's a couple of universities that have like a polling operation. They're one of the most notable ones. They did a poll asking about all kinds of questions about the Supreme Court and recent cases, especially high-profile ones. And of course, they asked about Bruin, and they found that 64% of Americans approved of the decision, and 35% disapproved. So, very strong support for that ruling in particular from the American public. Interestingly, this was despite the fact that the court has relatively low marks from the general public. I believe it was 66% disapprove of the way the court has handled itself over the last couple of years. And so it's really not just a general support for the court, but people seem to view the Bruin decision in particular as a positive.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a big finding. I think it sort of tracks, I would say, with a little bit of what we've been covering in terms of Americans' attitudes more generally towards, I think, the right to carry. You talk about how over time it's been about 40 years where the majority of the country didn't allow the right to carry. It's just Vermont and then a handful of other states. And then gradually you've seen nationwide now, all 50 states at least have some semblance of a right to carry a gun outside the home for self-defense. And I think that probably has something to do with normalizing it among the American people, where a decision that just says, yeah, that's your right, doesn't exactly upset people the way that perhaps some gun control advocates might have expected that to happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the broader scope of the ruling is really just that effectively you can't block people from exercising their right to bear arms. And to be specific, the question they asked was about that general principle of the right to carry a gun outside the home. And so it didn't get into all of the details of Bruin. Obviously, there's the new standard that the court set in the case for how to decide future gun cases, which is certainly still very controversial among activists, right? Among gun control activists, and left-leaning academics are still very upset about the new standard that's in place that'll probably have a much larger impact than the specifics of this ruling itself. And the poll doesn't ask about that in particular. So it'd still be great to get even more polling on the issue. It's really not something that gets polled a lot.
Right.
But clearly Americans approve of the overall concept of what this court did in this case. And their approval actually has increased since July when they first asked this question. It's up, I believe, 7 points. Well, 8 points since July, 7 points since September. And so that's an interesting trend as well. It's actually become more popular as some of the effects have started to be felt. You're seeing laws get blocked because of the Bruin ruling, beyond just gun carry laws. And, you've seen even federal laws get blocked because of this ruling. And, really quickly, it's only been 6 months, right, at this point, less than 6 months, really. And the effects on the legal landscape are already materializing, and people have, at the same time that's occurring, have become more supportive of the decision. So that's interesting for sure. And it comes at the same time that people are becoming less supportive of the Supreme Court overall. The Supreme Court had a 60% approval rating, or job approval rating, just about a year ago. And then it seems, at least in the polling and from what Marquette is arguing, that the Dobbs decision to overturn Roe v. Wade and the abortion case is what's driving a lot of the dissatisfaction with the court. That ruling is much less popular than Bruin, but people seem to have, been able to compartmentalize their reaction to the various court rulings, and they're not just, dissatisfied across the board. They're really looking at each individual case differently, apparently. And the Supreme Court as an institution still has large majority support, even though people may not like the direction it went in the Dobbs case.
Yeah, no, that's definitely an interesting point. I think it sort of speaks to perhaps the longevity of this decision, because, future iterations of the court may be composed of justices that, view the Second Amendment jurisprudence different. But when you have public opinion this in favor of a decision, obviously we like to think of justices being removed from public opinion, but they're human beings. They're still, of course, influenced by broader trends like that. So I think that does speak, at least for now, speaks well to the staying power of that decision. Decisions like Heller, decisions like Bruin, where their basic holdings, talking about the right to keep a handgun or the right to carry a handgun for self-defense, have sort of become normalized and embraced by the culture. I think you'll see much more staying power for things like that because it has such buy-in from the public.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that really the court was a late mover on this stuff compared to public opinion, because, handguns were extremely popular by the time the court got around to ruling in Heller, which effectively in practice just said that handguns can't be completely outlawed. And by that point, nobody wanted to outlaw them, like they may have, according to, Gallup polling decades back. That was the initial big focus of, the current gun control movement. The Brady groups were started as handgun control groups. And, they've obviously shifted course completely since that time because that position just became completely untenable. And the court eventually caught up to this decades later. And as you alluded to earlier, gun carry used to be, concealed carry at least, used to be completely banned almost everywhere in the country. And then slowly over time, since the 1990s, it became legal everywhere in the country, with even the holdouts that got addressed in Bruin. It was technically legal to get a concealed carry license and carry a gun. And people, they did issue them in most of those states. They just were extremely, extremely restrictive in who actually got permits. And that's really what the court effectively took issue with. So really public opinion was moving well before the court got, I mean, even, with concealed carry, of course, you had states move into shall issue regimes for their permits. And then from there, a lot of states had already moved. 25 states by the time the court ruled in Bruin had already adopted constitutional carry or permitless carry, which doesn't require a permit at all, right? To carry a gun concealed. So the court really hasn't been, at least to this point with its rulings, a trend setter. They've been reacting to where the public opinion is on firearms in this country. So it's not necessarily super surprising, right, that people generally approve of what they're doing.
Right. And I think something interesting along those lines to watch is, like you said, they've traditionally been sort of a lagging indicator on whatever cases they take up. Well, we've been covering in recent years, very recently, sort of the diminishing support for assault weapon bans, even after big mass shootings. So it'll be interesting to see if a lot of people think that could be one of the next big gun cases that the court takes up, whether it's, a year from now, a couple of years from now. It'll be interesting to see what they do there, because we've already started to see public opinion turn on assault weapons bans. And that could very well be the next lagging indicator that the Supreme Court decides to take up. So definitely one to watch, I think.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that it also undercuts this effort to sort of try and counteract the Bruin ruling that you've seen in places like New York, and you're seeing now in New Jersey and California as well, with these laws that basically just fly in the face of what the court had ruled.
Right.
Because it doesn't seem very likely that even if the court were susceptible to public opinion shifts on this issue, obviously the public is largely on the side of the court in this area. So that probably is further reason to think that it's not going to be successful, these efforts to just kind of thumb their nose at what the court ruled. And of course, I think it'll be interesting to see if and when the court goes out ahead of public opinion on some of these issues. Like, are they going to get rulings because of the standard in Bruin, which sets a pretty high bar for gun laws to clear, especially modern regulations? Are you going to get to a point where, the court rules on something that the public is more split on, is less, less decided on as far as gun policy goes? It hasn't happened yet. We've only gotten a couple of gun cases in the history of the Supreme Court. So we're still super early in this jurisprudence, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here.
No, I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's all we've got for you this week. Thank you guys for tuning in to listen. If you want to support the show, please leave a review wherever you're listening to this. Like it on Facebook, share it, subscribe to our Facebook channel. And if you want to go an extra step further to help us thrive here at The Reload, you can head over to thereload.com and buy a membership today. That's how we make our living, through those memberships. And with your support, we are able to bring you this kind of reporting. Plus, you get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and reporting that you won't get anywhere else. You'll get also early access to this podcast. You'll get it a day early, day before everybody else. And you'll have the opportunity to appear on the show as well. So head on over and check out our membership options today. Thank you.